On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court delivered one of the most consequential antitrust rulings in world economic history. In a monumental unanimous decision, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White declared that the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was an illegal monopoly that had unreasonably restrained interstate commerce. The highest court in the nation ordered the immediate dissolution of the colossal petroleum trust, demanding that it be dismantled into 33 separate, independent operating companies. This historic verdict brought an end to 4 decades of unprecedented industrial dominance by a single corporate empire. At the center of this titanic legal struggle stood John Davison Rockefeller, a quiet, hyper-disciplined merchant who had methodically organized the chaotic American oil industry. The story of Standard Oil is not merely the tale of an aggressive monopoly, but a foundational masterclass in economies of scale, supply chain integration, and ruthless corporate strategy. To truly understand how Standard Oil became powerful enough to command 90% of the global petroleum trade, we must return to the dawn of the American oil boom. In 1859, Edwin Drake struck Rock Oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, setting off a frenzied, speculative rush that rivaled the California gold rush. Thousands of wildcat drillers rushed to Pennsylvania, punching haphazard wooden derricks into the hillsides and pumping crude oil out of the earth as fast as humanly possible. The early petroleum market was plagued by violent boom-and-bust cycles, wild price fluctuations, and catastrophic waste as crude overflowed wooden-holding barrels. While most speculators fixated on drilling wells, a young Cleveland merchant named John D. Rockefeller recognized that the real strategic choke point was not extraction, but refining. Crude oil emerging from the ground was practically useless until it was distilled into clean, safe kerosene for household lamps. In 1863, Rockefeller invested in a modest Cleveland oil refinery, applying relentless cost accounting and industrial discipline to every step of the manufacturing process. He refused to waste a single byproduct of the distillation process, capturing gasoline, lubricating oils, paraffin wax, and petroleum jelly while rival refiners dumped them into nearby rivers. Rockefeller realized that to achieve dominant profitability, he had to eliminate third-party middlemen across his entire manufacturing supply chain. He purchased his own timber tracks to manufacture wooden barrels, built dedicated barrel manufacturing cooperages, and even purchased iron smelting facilities to make his own metal hoops. By manufacturing his own barrels at less than half the market price, Rockefeller drove down his per-unit operating costs far below any local competitor. He also invested in his own chemical manufacturing plants to produce sulfuric acid, an essential reagent required for purifying raw kerosene. In 1870, Rockefeller consolidated his growing operations by formally incorporating the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with $1 million in capital. The company's very name, Standard Oil, was a deliberate marketing promise to consumers that its kerosene met uniform standards of purity and would not explode in domestic lamps. However, superior refining efficiency was only the first pillar of Rockefeller's grand strategic vision. The second, and far more lethal, pillar was his mastery of transportation logistics and confidential freight negotiations. Because Cleveland was geographically separated from the Pennsylvania oil fields, refiners relied heavily on competing railroad networks to transport crude in and finished kerosene out to Atlantic ports. Rockefeller leveraged his enormous, predictable shipping volumes to extract secret rebates and discounts from the major railroad trunk lines, including the Erie, the Pennsylvania, and the New York Central. In 1871, Rockefeller joined forces with railroad barons to orchestrate the notorious South Improvement Company scheme. Under this clandestine arrangement, participating railroads agreed not only to grant steep freight rebates to cartel members, but also to pay them a drawback on every barrel shipped by non-member rivals. This meant that whenever a competing refiner paid full freight on a rail shipment, a portion of that competitor's freight fee was quietly transferred into Standard Oil's bank account. Although public fury and armed protests by independent oil producers quickly forced the cancellation of the South Improvement Charter, Rockefeller had already achieved his strategic objective. Using the threat of railroad discrimination, Rockefeller executed the legendary Cleveland Massacre of 1872. Over the course of just 3 months, Standard Oil systematically acquired 22 of its 26 refining competitors in Cleveland. Rockefeller would invite rival refinery owners into his private office, open his accounting ledgers, and demonstrate that his operating costs were so low that their businesses could never survive open competition. He offered them a direct choice: sell their refineries for cash or accept shares in the growing Standard Oil enterprise. Those who accepted Standard Oil stock became immensely wealthy over the subsequent decades, while those who refused were steadily driven into insolvency. With Cleveland firmly under his control, Rockefeller expanded his horizontal acquisition strategy across Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York, and the refining hubs of the East Coast. Whenever an independent refiner refused a buyout offer, Standard Oil deployed localized predatory pricing, flooding the rival's home market with kerosene priced well below cost until the competitor went bankrupt. Once the local competitor surrendered, Standard Oil would raise kerosene prices back to highly profitable monopoly levels. To cement its near-total grip on transportation, Standard Oil began investing millions of dollars into long-distance crude oil pipelines during the late 1870s. When independent Pennsylvania producers attempted to construct the Tidewater Pipeline over the Allegheny Mountains to bypass railroad tariffs, Standard Oil responded with ruthless countertactics. Standard Oil attempted to purchase narrow strips of land across the pipeline's planned route to block right-of-way construction, and when that failed, it built its own competing trans-regional pipeline network. Within a few short years, Standard Oil owned virtually the entire pipeline gathering grid connecting Pennsylvania oil fields directly to Atlantic refineries. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of all petroleum refining capacity in the United States and owned almost the entire gathering pipeline infrastructure. To distribute its products globally, Standard Oil built its own fleet of specialized railroad tank cars, ocean-going steam tankers, and regional bulk distribution warehouses. It introduced the iconic 5-gallon kerosene tin with its distinctive blue cap, shipping millions of sealed containers to households across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. In China, Standard Oil distributed millions of cheap tin kerosene lamps, known as Meifu lamps, effectively creating a massive consumer market for American kerosene from scratch. At the same time, Standard Oil fought intense global market share battles against Russian crude from Baku, fiercely competing against the Rothschild and Nobel oil enterprises. To manage this sprawling web of dozens of nominally independent corporate entities across multiple state jurisdictions, Standard Oil's brilliant corporate attorney Samuel Dodd conceived the legal structure of the business trust in 1882. Under the Standard Oil Trust Agreement, stockholders of 40 separate corporations secretly surrendered their shares and voting control to 9 trustees in exchange for trust certificates. This ingenious mechanism allowed Rockefeller and his executive committee to dictate operational quotas, pricing strategies, and capital investments across the entire continent from their headquarters at 26 Broadway in New York. The sheer economic power of the Standard Oil Trust ignited widespread public backlash among farmers, small business owners, and independent oil producers who felt crushed by monopolistic pricing. State attorneys general began launching anti-monopoly lawsuits against local Standard Oil subsidiaries, prompting the Ohio Supreme Court to order the dissolution of the Ohio Trust Agreement in 1892. In response to growing public outrage against corporate trusts in oil, steel, beef, and railroads, the United States Congress overwhelmingly passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. The Sherman Act declared illegal every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of interstate trade, making corporate monopolization a federal offense punishable by law. Despite the passage of the federal statute, Standard Oil adapted quickly, moving its primary corporate umbrella to New Jersey after the state enacted permissive legislation that allowed holding companies to own stock in other corporations. For more than a decade after 1890, the reconstituted Standard Oil Company of New Jersey operated with near impunity, continuing to generate tens of millions of dollars in annual dividend payouts. Standard Oil maintained an extensive corporate intelligence apparatus, paying railroad station agents to report the destination and volume of every single competing oil shipment. However, the turn of the 20th century brought a formidable new force into American civic life: the rise of investigative journalism and progressive reform. Between 1902 and 1904, journalist Ida Tarbell published a blistering 19-part investigative series in McClure's magazine titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined by Rockefeller's South Improvement scheme in the Pennsylvania oil region, spent years combing through public records, court testimonies, and confidential internal memoranda. She was secretly aided by Standard Oil executive Henry Huddleston Rogers, who provided her with extensive internal documents under the assumption that her reporting would validate the company's business brilliance. Instead, Tarbell's groundbreaking reporting meticulously exposed Standard Oil's secret railroad rebates, market espionage networks, predatory pricing schemes, and the systematic coercion of independent distributors. Tarbell's expose captured the national imagination and transformed public resentment of industrial monopolies into an irresistible political movement. President Theodore Roosevelt seized upon this public momentum, instructing the Federal Bureau of Corporations to launch a comprehensive investigation into Standard Oil's anti-competitive practices. Roosevelt publicly denounced the heads of corporate trusts as malefactors of great wealth, demanding strict federal enforcement of the Sherman Antitrust Act. In November 1906, Attorney General Charles Bonaparte and Special Counsel Frank Kellogg filed a landmark antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Act. The federal government named 70 subsidiaries and individual directors, including John D. Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, and Henry Flagler, as co-conspirators in an unlawful monopoly. The government presented thousands of exhibits, court transcripts, and shipping invoices demonstrating that Standard Oil had systematically crushed competition and maintained an illegal stranglehold over American commerce. Standard Oil's defense argued that its colossal size and 90% market share were the natural result of superior efficiency, visionary economies of scale, and technological integration. Defense attorneys maintained that the Sherman Act was never intended to punish industrial success or prevent companies from expanding their commercial reach. The high-stakes legal battle dragged on for 4.5 years, progressing through federal circuit courts before finally reaching the Supreme Court in 1911. Chief Justice White's unanimous opinion established the famous rule of reason legal doctrine, which fundamentally reshaped the future of American antitrust jurisprudence. The court ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act could not be interpreted as banning all commercial contracts that incidentally restrain trade, as that would paralyze modern business enterprise. Instead, the law prohibited only unreasonable restraints of trade and monopolistic conduct that suppress competition through exclusionary, predatory practices. The court concluded that Standard Oil's history of coercing railroad rebates, predatory price cutting, and secret cartel agreements constituted an egregious pattern of unreasonable restraint. Standard Oil was given 6 months to dissolve itself and spin off 33 distinct corporate entities, including Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, and Standard Oil of Indiana. Yet, the ultimate economic aftermath of the Supreme Court's dissolution order produced one of the greatest financial ironies in history. When the 33 successor companies began trading as independent, publicly listed entities on Wall Street, the rapid rise of the automobile and the surge in global demand for gasoline caused their individual stock valuations to skyrocket. Because John D. Rockefeller owned approximately 25% of the original trust shares, his personal net worth multiplied exponentially following the court-ordered breakup. Within just a few years of a dissolution, Rockefeller's personal fortune exceeded $900 million, making him the world's first documented billionaire and the wealthiest private citizen in modern history. The fractured pieces of Standard Oil went on to become the dominant energy giants of the modern era, eventually evolving into ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP America, and Marathon Petroleum. Furthermore, the legal victories spurred the United States Congress to enact the Clayton Antitrust Act and establish the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 to strengthen federal regulatory oversight. The Standard Oil breakup demonstrated that a government could successfully dismantle the largest corporate monopoly on earth, while laying the judicial foundation for modern antitrust enforcement that continues to govern big tech and corporate mergers today. Please note that this video is intended strictly for educational and historical analysis and does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. Understanding the lessons of industrial concentration and regulatory oversight helps us better analyze the evolving corporate landscape of our modern economy. Rockefeller's empire may have been dismantled, but the market principles and legal frameworks forged during the